My parents left 2 empty seats at my wedding because they said they could not support the man I was marrying. A few years later, those same people were standing in my driveway talking about their grandchildren, as if the wedding they skipped had been a minor disagreement and not a defining act of rejection. That was when I understood the problem more clearly. They had not changed their view of what they did. They had reached a point where they wanted something from me. If they had missed my wedding and stayed away, that would have been one kind of grief. It would have been terrible, but at least it would have been honest. I could have built my life around the fact that my parents chose their judgment over my joy and accepted the consequences of that choice. That is not what happened. They missed my wedding, left me to stand there with 2 empty seats where my parents should have been, and then years later came back expecting access to the grandchildren that marriage gave them. If they had returned with sorrow, the story might have been different. They did not return with sorrow. They returned with entitlement. That difference mattered more than anything else. People often say, they're still your parents, as if biology should erase public abandonment, humiliation, and years of controlled disapproval. The older I get, the less persuasive I find titles that are not backed by behavior. Parent is a title. So is grandparent. A person can technically hold both and still fail the work that comes with them. Before the wedding, I believed they would come around enough to show up. I did not expect enthusiasm. I knew they did not like my husband. They had made that clear in every possible tone short of outright blessing. What I still believed was that they understood the difference between disapproval and abandonment. They did not. My parents disliked my husband from the beginning. Depending on the day, he was too different, too blunt, too independent, too unlike our kind of people, or too unwilling to perform the gratitude they believed basic civility should earn. The reasons kept shifting just enough to preserve their moral posture. If the standard keeps moving, the outsider can never quite meet it, and the objection can continue sounding thoughtful instead of territorial. At first, I tried to manage it. I translated for him and softened for them. I explained their tone to him and his tone to them, as if I were some tired diplomatic channel between two sides that had never formally declared war but had already fortified the border. I told myself they needed time. I told myself that once they saw how serious we were, they would settle down. I told myself that wedding stress makes everyone strange and that what looked like rejection might actually be fear, clumsy concern, or the usual family distortion that grows around major events. I told myself all of that because the alternative was harder to face. The alternative was that my parents wanted control more than they wanted relationship. The planning period should have been busy in the ordinary way. Instead, it turned into a long test of how much disrespect I was willing to reinterpret in the name of keeping the peace. My mother stopped talking about the wedding as if it were a real event in her own daughter's life. My father went quiet, which in my family has never meant calm. It means judgment that no longer feels the need to argue because it believes it has already won. They did not help. They did not ask what I needed. They did not ask about the venue, the dress, the guest list, or any of the ordinary things families at least pretend to care about when love outranks disapproval. They stayed cold. As the wedding got closer, the coldness became something worse. Calls were not returned. Messages came back flat and dry. The tone shifted into something that felt like advance absence, as if they were withdrawing emotionally before they withdrew physically so that the final act would cost them less. I remember the conversation clearly. I asked them directly whether they were coming. That question was humiliating in itself. A grown woman should not have to ask her own parents whether they plan to attend her wedding in the tone of someone asking whether a promise will be honored. My mother said she did not think it would be honest for them to celebrate a union they did not believe in. That was the language she chose. A union. Not my wedding. Not my marriage. Not my life. A union. My father said very little. He agreed with her in the quiet, settled way that always made it sound as if he had not acted at all when in fact he had signed the whole thing. After the call ended, I sat there staring at the wall and felt my body go cold before I cried. Cold in the hands. Cold in the face. Cold in the center of my chest. My body understood before my mind fully did that this was no longer a disagreement. It was a boycott. They were making a statement, and the statement was that they would rather publicly withhold themselves from my wedding than stand beside me while I married the man I loved. There is no way to make that feel normal once it is said plainly. The wedding itself was beautiful. It was also permanently altered by them. People who have not lived through this like to imagine that joy and absence can be kept in separate rooms. They think that if you focus on your spouse, the missing people fade into the background. That is not how it works. Empty seats have weight. They say things all through the ceremony without making a sound. I knew exactly where my parents should have been sitting. I knew who noticed. I knew who was kind enough not to ask and who was cruel enough to ask later in soft voices. I knew that everyone there who loved me was also doing their own silent calculation about what kind of parents skip their child's wedding because they disapprove of the spouse. What I hated most was not that my husband had been rejected. It was that I had to be publicly abandoned and then privately expected to understand the principles behind it. My husband handled that day better than I did. He never turned it into a referendum on himself, even though he had been rejected too. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not turn bitter and self-righteous in ways that would have forced me to defend my parents when I should have been allowed to grieve them. He stayed steady. He held the line of the day when mine kept wavering. He made sure our wedding still felt like the beginning of something rather than only the proof of what had been withheld. That steadiness became important later. Because when my parents came back, they were not just coming back toward me. They were coming back toward the family he and I built after they made it clear they did not respect its foundation. The first year after the wedding was ugly in a quiet way. There was no apology. No clear attempt at repair. Mostly there was silence interrupted by small intrusions disguised as normal contact. Holiday messages that skipped over the wound. Birthday calls that sounded too bright. The kind of communication people use when they want to preserve access without acknowledging why access became complicated. That kind of half-contact has its own cruelty. If they had fully disowned me, the shape of the loss would have been cleaner. Instead, they wanted the satisfaction of disapproval without the full relational cost of rejection. They wanted to boycott the marriage without losing their title to me entirely. That was never going to hold. Marriage changed the structure of the relationship. Children changed it even more. When I was pregnant the first time, I did not tell them right away. That was not revenge. It was caution. I was not trying to punish them with secrecy. I was protecting one of the most vulnerable and hopeful times of my adult life from people who had already proven they could turn joy into judgment if the joy did not obey them. I told them later than most daughters probably would have. Their reaction was immediate and deeply familiar. Not remorse. Not, "We know we have no right to ask for anything after what we did." Not, "We are sorry for the pain we caused, and we would understand if you needed distance." It was excitement wrapped around entitlement. My mother cried. My father started asking practical questions. They wanted updates, photos, the due date, the sex of the baby, and plans for when they could come. They started talking about what kind of grandparents they were going to be. That phrase was almost enough to make me laugh. What kind of grandparents? As if we were all starting from the same place. As if the wedding had been weather and the baby was now a new season. As if the marriage they refused to honor had suddenly become respectable enough because it had produced a grandchild they wanted to claim. That was when something in me hardened for good. Until then, some part of me had still believed that if they ever came back, shame would arrive first. It did not. Demand arrived first. That changed the entire moral balance of the situation. By then, I could see that they did not regard the wedding as a permanent injury in the way I did. To them, it had been a principled stand, perhaps regrettable at worst, perhaps misread by me, but certainly not something that should continue to shape what came next. I knew otherwise. They had not done their best. They had done what they wanted. Now they wanted something else. My husband saw that before I wanted to. One night, after my mother left a long, eager voicemail about our grandbaby, He asked whether I had noticed that neither of my parents had apologized. I said I knew. He said, no, I mean really noticed. Because they're talking like they're owed a clean start. He was right. That was exactly what they were doing. They were not asking. They were skipping the hard middle. They were jumping straight from rejection to access. That was when I started to understand that grandchildren, for some parents, are not about love first. They're about relevance, continuity, and a path back into a family system they damaged without having to pass through humility. I could not ignore that. Whatever I might once have tolerated for myself, I was no longer willing to bring that unfinished damage into a home with children in it. A child does not understand family politics in adult terms. A child understands tone, safety, warmth, tension, and which adult seems to dislike one of their parents while still wanting access to them. Children notice that long before adults like to admit it. So when my parents began pushing for access, I was not thinking only about fairness to them. I was thinking about what kind of people refuse to attend their child's wedding because they disapprove of the spouse and then later expect a relationship with the children of that marriage without first showing respect for it. To me, the answer was clear. Not safe enough. They tried several versions of the same pressure. First, it was eagerness. The warm, excited grandparent version. We can help. We can come by. We'll bring things. This is such a blessing. The language itself dares you to look hard at the history, because doing so makes you sound cruel in the face of all that apparent warmth. When eagerness did not work, they moved to confusion. We don't understand why you're being distant. That line is infuriating to anyone who has been rejected and then told not to remember it too well. Of course they understood. They understood enough to skip the wedding. They understood enough to let me explain their absence to my husband's family, our friends, and everyone else at that ceremony. Now, suddenly, they were mystified. When confusion did not work, guilt arrived. We're not getting any younger. Do you really want to keep this going? The baby should know all her grandparents. Family is family. That phrase, family is family, is one of the favorite tools of people who mistake biology for permanent exemption from accountability. Family should have mattered when I got married. Family should have mattered when I stood in formal clothes and my parents chose not to be there. Family should have mattered when my husband crossed the threshold into my life and they refused to treat him as part of it. Now, with grandchildren involved, they had rediscovered the word. That alone told me enough. By the time our first child was born, I had reached a point that made some relatives deeply uncomfortable. I was no longer interested in symbolic peace. I was interested in actual terms. If my parents wanted access, I needed 3 things from them. An acknowledgement of what they had done. Respect for my husband. An acceptance that grandchildren are not a side door around a rejected marriage. Without those 3 things, there was no real relationship to build. There was only sentiment layered over damage and future harm waiting for a place to settle. They did not like those terms. Not because the terms were harsh, but because they required memory. Memory is what people like that always try to soften first. They want closeness without chronology. Access without sequence. They want to arrive in the chapter that benefits them without rereading the chapters where they failed you. I would not let them do that. So I asked for something basic. An apology. Not a perfect one. Not a performance. Just an acknowledgement that skipping my wedding over who I married had been deeply hurtful, and that if they wanted to be in our children's lives, they needed to begin by respecting the marriage they had rejected. My mother cried. My father got angry. That told me almost everything. The crying was not remorse. It was injury at being asked to account for herself. The anger was even more revealing. He said they had been honest about their concerns. He said parents have the right to disapprove. He said I was rewriting history if I turned their absence into something more dramatic than it was. More dramatic than it was. 2 empty seats at their daughter's wedding. No support. No blessing. No presence. And somehow I was the one being theatrical. That was when I stopped protecting their self-image. I said, plainly, you do not get to reject my husband and then demand a relationship with the children I had with him as if those things are unrelated. My mother said they had never rejected the children. I said, the children came from the marriage you refused to honor. After that, there was silence. That silence told the truth even though no one in it was prepared to speak it aloud. Then came the wider family. One had called to say life was too short. A cousin said I should not use the children as leverage. Someone else said maybe the baby could be a bridge. I noticed that the people who had not sat in that ceremony looking at my parents' empty seats had endless language for why my parents' comfort should now be prioritized. That is another familiar insult in family systems. The person who was originally harmed is told that their refusal to move quickly enough toward reconciliation has now become the real injury. The original betrayal becomes backstory. The present discomfort of the wrongdoers becomes the urgent issue. I refuse that framing. My children are not leverage. My children are not emotional repair kits for adults who do not want to apologize. My children are not neutral territory where grandparents get to arrive and behave as if history only matters when it favors them. That stance made some people angry. I was finished being the only person expected to be reasonable. One incident settled me even further. My parents sent gifts. That alone was not unusual. The way they did it was. The gifts were addressed to the baby only. The note talked about how much they loved their granddaughter already and how grandparents should not be kept away from precious time. There was no mention of me. No mention of my husband. No apology. No accountability. Just a sentimental claim placed directly on top of an old wound. I stared at that note for a long time because it said exactly what I had been afraid of. They wanted the child in a way that bypassed us. That was what I could never allow. If grandparents establish a relationship while they still fundamentally disrespect one of the parents, the child eventually becomes the battlefield. It may not start dramatically. It may begin with tone, exclusion, omission, or the little coded comments adults assume children will not register. Comments about our side of the family. Stories told with one parent blurred out. Affection offered in a way that carries a hierarchy inside it. Children notice more than adults admit. Even when they do not understand the full meaning, they understand the split. I was not going to build that split into my home with my own permission. My husband was steadier about all of this than I expected, and I still feel grateful when I think about it. He never pushed me to reconcile for the sake of appearance. He never said, "They're your parents, do what you have to do." He understood that what they had done was not just about him, even though he had been the formal target. It was about whether our marriage would be treated as real and deserving of respect. He said something once that I have never forgotten. If they can't honor the door, they don't get to walk through it. He was right. The wedding was the door. They refused it. Now they wanted entry by another route. No. Eventually the demands became more direct. Visits. Holidays. Photos. FaceTime. Then came the language of rights without the word rights. A child should know her grandparents. We deserve a chance. This is not fair. There are very few people from whom I want to hear the word fair less than the parents who skipped my wedding because I married the man I loved and later showed up asking for access to the grandchildren that marriage produced. Fair would have been showing up. Fair would have been disapproving privately and still loving publicly. Fair would have been swallowing discomfort for one day and not forcing their daughter to explain the shape of rejection in formal clothes. Fair would have been apology first, access second. They chose none of that. So I stopped accepting lectures on fairness from people who only rediscovered the concept when grandchildren entered the picture. I wish I could say the boundary resolved everything quickly. It did not. Boundaries rarely solve family problems quickly. They reveal them more clearly. Once my parents understood that I was serious, they moved from confusion and guilt into reputation management. They started telling people they were being kept from the grandchildren. That phrase is built to erase cause. It makes them sound like victims of arbitrary cruelty rather than people encountering the consequences of their own public rejection. A few relatives repeated the phrase to me. I corrected them every time. No, I said. They are being kept from easy access because they still haven't acknowledged skipping my wedding over my husband. I learned that if I did not keep the order intact, the family would rewrite it for me by the next meal. That is one reason I am so direct about it now. Cause and effect matter. They skipped the wedding. They rejected the marriage. They offered no apology. Then they demanded access. That is the order. If the order gets lost, so does the truth. Time passed. Our children grew. My parents remained outside what could have been theirs if they had acted differently. That sounds harsh because it is harsh. So was what they chose. There were moments when I questioned myself. Anyone honest would. Birthdays, holidays, school events, certain quiet evenings when nostalgia starts dressing itself up as morality and whispering that maybe the children are missing something beautiful, maybe I am too rigid, maybe time itself should count as repair. Then I would remember the wedding. Not abstractly. Precisely. The silence. The empty seats. The questions. The way I had to keep moving through joy with grief tied to the bottom of it like a weight no one else could fully see. More than that, I would remember the aftermath. No apology. No remorse. Only demands later, when there was finally something they wanted. That memory brought my judgment back into alignment every time. The issue is never whether grandparents, in theory, are good for children. Of course, loving grandparents can be a gift. The issue was whether these particular grandparents had shown the humility, respect, and change required to be safe inside the family they once tried to shame. For a long time, the answer was no. Perhaps one day that answer changes. I am honest enough to leave room for that in theory. But if it changes, it will not be because time passed and everybody got tired. It will not be because other relatives want easier holidays. It will not be because age turns old cruelty into sacred seniority. It will not be because grandchildren are charming enough to erase the sequence of what happened. It will change only if they do the work they skipped the first time. Truth. Apology. Respect. Patience. No demands. No rewritten history. No attempt to build a grandparent relationship while acting as if my husband is still the unfortunate decision they were too principled to support. Until then, my answer remains the same. If you could not stand beside my marriage when it began, you do not get to claim the children that came from it as if they arrived separately from the life you rejected. My parents skipped my wedding because of who I married. What they did not understand that day was that they were not only missing a ceremony. They were deciding how far outside my future they were willing to stand. Years later, when they came back demanding access to that future in the form of my children, they acted shocked to find the distance still there. They built that distance themselves.